In February 1938, my career in the General Staff, which had led me to the post of First Oberquartiermeister, Deputy Chief of the General Staff, that is, the second most important position in the General Staff, came to an abrupt end. When Colonel General Baron von Fritsch, as a result of the diabolical intrigues of the party, was removed from the post of Commander of the Land Forces, at the same time a number of his closest collaborators, among whom I was among them, were removed from the Oak. Having been appointed to the post of Commander of the 18th Division in Liegnitz, I was naturally no longer involved in matters that fell within the competence of the General Staff. From the beginning of April 1938, I was able to devote myself fully to my duties as Division Commander. The fulfillment of these duties was particularly satisfying in those years, but it required the full exertion of all my strength. After all, the task of increasing the size of the army was far from being accomplished. Moreover, the continuous formation of new units constantly required changes in the composition of the existing compounds. The pace of rearmament, the associated rapid growth of primarily the officer and non-commissioned officer corps, made high demands on commanders of all ranks if we wanted to achieve our goal: to create well-trained, internally cohesive troops capable of ensuring the security of the empire. The results of this work were all the more satisfying, especially for me, who, after many years in Berlin, had the happy opportunity to establish direct contact with the troops. It is with great gratitude that I therefore remember these last year and a half of peace, and especially the Silesians, who formed the core of the 18th Division. Silesia has long supplied good soldiers, and thus the military education and training of new units was a grateful task. During the brief interlude of the Flower War, I mean the occupation of the Sudetenland, which had become part of the Empire, I was already Chief of Staff of the army commanded by Colonel General von Lieb. While in that position, I learned of the conflict which had begun between the Chief of the General Staff of the army, General Beck, and Hitler on the Bohemian question, and which led, to my deep regret, to the resignation of the Chief of the General Staff, for whom I have the utmost respect. With this resignation, the last thread that had bound me, thanks to Beck's confidence in the General Staff, was severed. It was therefore not until the summer of 1939 that I learned of the Weiss Deployment Directive, the first plan of attack on Poland, drawn up on Hitler's orders. No such plan existed until the spring of 1939. On the contrary, all military activities on our eastern border were aimed at defense, as well as security in case of conflict with other powers. According to the Directive Weiss, I was to take the post of Chief of Staff of Army Group South, the commander of which was to be Colonel General van Rundstedt, who had already retired. The deployment of this army group was to take place according to the directive in Silesia, Eastern Moravia, and partly in Slovakia. Its details had now to be worked out. Since the headquarters of this army group did not exist in peacetime, and its formation was to take place only when mobilization was announced, a small working staff was set up to work out the deployment plan. It met on August 12, 1939 at the Negammer training field in Silesia. The working staff was headed by Colonel Blumentritt of the General Staff. When mobilization was announced, he was to take over as Chief of Operations of the Army Group headquarters. I considered it a great stroke of luck, for I was connected with this extremely energetic man, ties of mutual trust. They had been formed during our work together at the headquarters of von Lieb's army during the Sudeten crisis, and it seemed to me especially valuable to work at such times together with a man whom I could trust. Just as sometimes small traits in a man's character make us love him, so I was particularly attracted to Colonel Blumentritt by his truly inexhaustible energy in telephone conversations. He worked already with incredible speed, but with the telephone receiver in his hand he solved avalanches of small questions, remaining always cheerful and amiable. In mid-August, the future commander of Army Group South, Colonel General von Rundstedt, arrived in Negammer. We all knew him. He was a brilliantly gifted military commander. He was able to immediately grasp the most important and dealt only with important issues. Everything that was secondary, he had absolutely no interest in. As for his personality, it was, as it is commonly expressed, a man of the old school. This style is unfortunately disappearing, although it used to enrich life with a nuance of courtesy. The Colonel General possessed charm. This charm could not be resisted even by Hitler. He harbored an apparently genuine affection for the Colonel General and, strangely enough, retained it even after he had twice subjected him to disgrace. Perhaps Hitler was attracted to Rundstedt, that he gave the impression of a man of the past, incomprehensible to him times, to the internal and external atmosphere of which he could never join. Incidentally, my 18th Division, too, at the time the headquarters assembled at New Gamma, was on its annual regimental and divisional exercises on the training field. I need not say that each of us was reflecting on the tremendous developments our homeland had undergone since 1933, and wondering where this path would lead. Our thoughts and many intimate conversations were riveted to the lightning storms flashing along the entire horizon. It was clear to us that Hitler was filled with an unshakable fanatical determination to resolve all the remaining territorial problems that Germany still faced as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. We knew that he had already begun negotiations with Poland in the fall of 1938 in order to settle the Polish-German border question once and for all. How these negotiations took place and whether they continued at all, we did not know. We did know, however, about the guarantees that Great Britain gave to Poland, and I can perhaps say that none of us soldiers were so self-confident, frivolous or short-sighted as not to see in this guarantee an exceptionally serious warning. Already for this reason, along with others, we in New Gamma were convinced that, in the end, the matter would not come to war after all. Even if the wise strategic deployment plan, which we were just working on at the time, had been realized, in our opinion, this would not yet have meant the beginning of war. So far, we had been closely following the disturbing events, the outcome of which hung in the balance all the time. We were each time more and more amazed at what incredible political luck had accompanied Hitler so far in achieving his rather transparent and hidden goals without the use of weapons. The man seemed to be acting on an almost infallible instinct. One success followed another, and the number of them was immense, if at all it is possible to call success that series of unfading events that were to lead us to ruin. All these successes were achieved without war. Why, we asked ourselves, should this time have been different? We recalled the events in Czechoslovakia. Hitler had deployed his forces along the borders of that country in 1938, threatening it, and yet there had been no war. True, the old German proverb that says that a jug is carried to the well until it breaks was already muffled in our ears. This time, moreover, the case was riskier, and the game that Hitler apparently wanted to repeat looked more dangerous. The British guarantee now lay in our way. Then we also recalled a statement by Hitler that he would never be as obtuse as some of the statesmen of 1914 who had launched a two-front war. He stated this, and at least these words spoke of cold reason, though his human feelings seemed petrified or deadened. He told his military advisers in harsh but solemn terms that he was not an idiot to get into a war over the city of Danzig or the Polish corridor. Sund was a source of bitter feelings for us, because she had acquired German lands under the Treaty of Versailles to which she could not claim either in terms of historical justice or on the basis of the right of nations to self-determination. Moreover, this fact was a constant source of concern to us soldiers during Germany's period of weakness. Any glance at a geographical map showed the unsightliness of the situation. What an unreasonable delineation of borders. How mutilated our homeland, this corridor tearing apart the Empire and East Prussia. When we soldiers looked at East Prussia separated from the country, we had every reason to worry about the fate of this beautiful province. Despite this, the command of the German armed forces never even discussed the question of an aggressive war against Poland to end this situation by force. The rejection of such an intention proceeded from a very simple consideration of a military nature, all other considerations aside. A war of aggression against Poland would immediately and inevitably draw the Empire into a war on two or more fronts which it would be unable to wage. During this period of weakness resulting from the Versailles dictate, we suffered all the time from the Kochmardes coalitions, and this nightmare made us suffer even more when we thought of the lust with which the broad circles of the Polish people still looked, poorly concealing their appetites at the German lands. An aggressive war? No. But when, without any prejudice, taking into account the national spirit of the Polish people, we considered the possibility, through peaceful negotiations at one table, of revising the question of the unreasonable drawing of the frontiers, we had little hope. However, it seemed not at all impossible that Poland herself might one day be able to raise the question of borders by threatening by force of arms. In this respect, we had already had some experience after 1918. Therefore, at that period of German weakness, it was not wrong to reckon with this possibility. If Marshal Pilsudski lost his influence and it passed to some nationalist Polish circles, an attack on East Prussia like the attack on Vilna was quite probable. But in such a case our reasoning led to certain political conclusions. If Poland had turned out to be the aggressor, and we had succeeded in repulsing the attack, it would have been possible for Germany, obviously by means of a political counterattack, to achieve a revision of the unfavourable drawing of the frontier. In any case, the leading figures of the army did not fill themselves with unfulfilled hope. When General von Rabenau in his book Sect from My Life quoted the Colonel General's words, "The existence of Poland is inadmissible. It is incompatible with the vital interests of Germany. It must disappear as a result of its own internal weakness and the efforts of Russia with our help." It was clear that this view, as a result of the development of political and military events, seemed to have become obsolete. We were fairly well aware of the growing military strength and power of the Soviet Union. France, a country whose charms were so easily succumbed to, unfortunately, for reasons that are difficult to ascertain, was still hostile to us. She would obviously always look for allies in our rear. In the event of the disappearance of the Polish state, however, the mighty Soviet Union could have become a much more dangerous neighbour to the empire than Poland, which at that time was a buffer state. The removal of the buffer that Poland formed between Germany and the Soviet Union could very easily have led to a conflict between these two great powers. A revision of the Polish frontier may have been in the interests of both states, but the complete elimination of the Polish state under conditions which had changed completely from the previous period was hardly in the interests of Germany. So it was better that Poland, whether we treated her with respect or not, should be between the Soviet Union and us. No matter how painful the meaningless, dynamite-loaded border was for us soldiers, Poland as a neighbour was less of a danger than the Soviet. Naturally, we, together with all Germans, hoped that one day the eastern border would be revised so that the areas with a predominantly German population would be returned to the empire by natural right of the inhabitants. But the growth of the Polish population in them was, from a military point of view, wholly undesirable. The demand for a link between East Prussia and the empire could well be combined with Poland's interest in a seaport of her own. Such, and not otherwise, were roughly the judgments about the Polish problem which prevailed in the days of the Reichswehr, say from the late 20s onward, among soldiers when it came to military conflict. Then the wheel of fate turned again. Adolf Hitler appeared on the stage of empire. Everything changed. Our relations with Poland changed radically. The empire concluded a non-aggression pact and a treaty of friendship with our eastern neighbour. We were freed from the nightmare of a possible Polish attack. At the same time, however, the political feelings between Germany and the Soviet Union cooled, for the Führer, ever since he began to address the masses, had made his hatred for the Bolshevik regime quite clear. In this new situation, Poland should have felt freer. But this greater freedom was not now dangerous for us. The rearmament of Germany and Hitler's series of foreign policy successes made it unrealistic for Poland to use her freedom for an offensive against the empire. When she expressed her even somewhat excessive readiness to take part in the partition of Czechoslovakia, the possibility of negotiating the border question did not seem to be excluded. In any case, the OK, until the spring of 1939, never had in its portfolio a plan of strategic deployment for the purpose of an offensive against Poland. All military preparations in the East up to that time had been of a purely defensive character. Did matters really have to go that far in the fall of 1939? Did Hitler want war, or did he, as he had done in the fall of 1938 with regard to Czechoslovakia, intend to take extreme measures, using the threat of military force to settle the Danzig question and the corridor question, just as he had done in the Sudeten question? War or bluff? That was the question, at least for someone who was not familiar with the true development of political events and, above all, with Hitler's intentions. And who was Hitler familiar with his real intentions anyway? In any case, those military measures which were taken in August 1939 could well, despite the existence of the Weiss deployment plan, have been aimed at increasing political pressure on Poland in order to force it to make concessions. Beginning in the summer, work was feverishly underway on Hitler's orders to create an eastern shaft. Entire divisions, including the 18th Division in constant rotation, were moved for several weeks to the Polish border to participate in the construction of this eastern wall. What was the point of this expenditure of manpower and resources if Hitler wanted to attack Poland? Even if, contrary to all assurances, he considered the possibility of a two-front war, This eastern wall was not erected where it was necessary, for in such a case it would always be the only correct thing for Germany to attack Poland first and defeat it, in the west to be limited to defensive fighting. The opposite solution, offensive in the west, defense in the east, was out of the question in the then existing balance of forces. There were no plans for an offensive in the west at that time, and there were no preparations. So if the construction of the eastern rampart in the situation created at that time had any sense, it obviously consisted only in putting pressure on Poland by concentrating large masses of troops on the Polish frontier. The deployment of infantry divisions on the eastern bank of the Oder, which began in the third decade of August, and the advance of tank and motorized divisions to concentration areas, initially west of the Oder, were not necessarily to be regarded as actual preparations for an offensive, but could have been a means of political pressure. Be that as it may, the program of training troops under peacetime conditions continued quietly. On August 13–14, 1939, I conducted the last exercises of my division at Neugamma, which ended with the troops passing in front of Colonel General von Rundstedt. On August 15, 1939, a large artillery exercise was conducted in conjunction with aviation. In doing so, a tragic incident occurred. An entire squadron of dive bombers, apparently the height of the cloud layer was incorrectly indicated, crashed into a forest while diving. On August 16, 1939, another regimental exercise was conducted. The division units then returned to their cantonment sites, which, however, they had to leave after a few days to move to the borders of Lower Silesia. On August 19, Colonel General von Rundstedt and myself were ordered on August 21 to come to Oberstberg for a meeting. On August 20, we left Liegnitz by motor car to the Linz area, where we spent the night at the home of my brother-in-law, who had an estate there. On August 21 in the morning, we arrived in Berchtesgaden. To Hitler were summoned all the commanders of the army groups, as well as the commanders of the armies with their chiefs of staff and their respective positions, commanders of air and naval formations. The meeting, or rather the speech with which Hitler addressed the military commanders, he allowed no further discussion after the events that took place the previous year before the Sack crisis during a meeting with the chiefs of staff, was delivered in the great hall of the Burj of Karlsruhe, which overlooked Salzburg. Shortly before Hitler arrived, Goering appeared. We were amazed at the sight of him. I believed that we were invited to a serious meeting. Goering apparently appeared at a masquerade. He wore a white shirt with a lapel collar and a green leather vest with large yellow buttons, covered with leather. The picture was completed by knee-length pants and long grey silk socks that strongly emphasized the huge size of his calves. The massive boots stood out against those thin socks, but the dagger that adorned his belly, dangling from a belt of red leather, lavishly trimmed with gold, in a sheath of the same colour leather, with gold ornaments, certainly overshadowed everything. Only whispered to my neighbour, General von Salmuths. The fat man, I suppose, is charged with guarding the halls. The prosecution at the Nuremberg trial of the German General Staff presented various so-called documents about Hitler's speech at that meeting. In one of them it was claimed that Hitler used the strongest expressions in his speech, and that Goering, from the joy of the forthcoming war, allegedly jumped up on the table and exclaimed, "Hail!" There is not a grain of truth in this. Hitler did not utter such words, as I'm afraid that at the last moment some bitch will come to me with a proposal for mediation. Hitler's speech, it is true, was couched in a spirit of clear determination, but he was too good a psychologist not to know that swear words or tirades cannot be used to influence the people who were present at that meeting. The content of his speech is largely correctly summarized in Greiner's book, The Leadership of the German Armed Forces 1939–1943. Greiner bases this on Colonel Warlemont's oral transmission of the contents of this speech for the battle log and on Admiral Canaris's verbatim record. Some entries from Colonel General Golder's diary are also noteworthy, although it seems to me possible that in the diary, as well as in the transmission of the content by Colonel Warlemont and Canaris, there are also statements that they heard from Hitler under other circumstances. It is on us, the generals who were not part of the supreme leadership. Hitler's speech made the following impression. Hitler made a categorical decision to immediately resolve the German-Polish question, even at the cost of war. If Poland, in the face of the already begun, although still disguised deployment of the German army, will submit to German pressure, which has already reached its climax, a peaceful solution is by no means impossible. Hitler is convinced that the Western powers in a decisive moment again will not take up arms. He substantiated this opinion in particular detail. His arguments boiled down mainly to the following: the backwardness of Great Britain and France in the field of armaments, especially aviation and air defence, the practical impossibility for the Western powers to provide effective assistance to Poland apart from an offensive through the Western Wall, to which both nations, due to the need to make great sacrifices, are unlikely to go. The foreign policy situation, especially the tense situation in the Mediterranean Sea area, greatly limiting the freedom of action, especially Great Britain, and the fact that the Western powers were not able to take up arms. Although the assessment of the situation in which the Western powers were, and seemed logical, and in many points correct, I still do not think that Hitler's words finally convinced those gathered. British guarantees, it is true, was almost the only argument that could be countered Hitler's statements, but it was still a very strong one. What Hitler said about a possible war against Poland could not, in my opinion, be understood as a policy of annihilation, as the Nuremberg prosecution claimed. If Hitler demanded the rapid and decisive destruction of the Polish army, this, if we translate this demand into military language, was precisely the goal which, after all, is pursued by any major offensive operation. None of us, at any rate, could understand his statements in the direction in which he later acted against the Poles. The greatest surprise, and at the same time the deepest impression, naturally, was the news of the impending pact with the Soviet Union. On our way to Berchtesgaden, we had already learned from the newspapers of the conclusion of a trade agreement in Moscow, which in the then atmosphere was in itself a sensation. Hitler now announced that the foreign minister von Ribbentrop, who had been present at the meeting, and to whom he said goodbye in our presence, was flying to Moscow to conclude a non-aggression pact with Stalin. In this way, he said, the Western powers had their main trump cards out of their hands. The blockade of Germany would also now fail. Hitler hinted that in order to make it possible to conclude the pact, he had made serious concessions to the Soviet Union in the Baltic states, as well as with regard to the eastern border of Poland. From his words, however, no conclusion could be drawn about a complete partition of Poland. In fact, Hitler, as it is known today, even during the Polish campaign, considered the question of preserving the remaining part of Poland. After listening to Hitler's speech, neither Colonel General von Rundstedt, nor I, nor apparently any of the other generals, concluded that it would now come to war under any circumstances. Two considerations especially seemed to compel the conclusion that at the last minute there would still, as at Munich, be a peaceful compromise. The first consideration was that as a result of the pact with the Soviet Union, the position of Poland had become hopeless, considering that the effect of this was to deprive England of the instrument of blockade, and that indeed to aid Poland she could only take the bloody path of an offensive in the West. It seemed probable that England, under pressure from France, would advise Poland to make concessions. On the other hand, it must now have become clear to Poland that the British guarantees had practically lost their force. Moreover, she had to reckon with the fact that, in the event of war with Germany, the Soviets would come to her rear to enforce their old demands for eastern Poland. In such an atmosphere, how could Warsaw not make concessions? Another consideration was the fact of the meeting in which we had just taken part. What was its purpose? So far, militarily, the intention to attack Poland had been carefully concealed. The concentration of divisions in the frontier strip was motivated by the construction of the Eastern Wall. To disguise the real purpose of the transfer of troops to East Prussia, a grand celebration of the anniversary of the Battle of Tannenberg was prepared. Preparations for major maneuvers of mechanized formations continued until the last moment. Deployment was carried out without an official announcement of mobilization. It was obvious that all these activities could not remain unknown to the Poles, that they were therefore of the nature of political pressure, but they were surrounded by great secrecy, and all means of disguise were employed. Now, at the climax of the crisis, Hitler summoned all the highest officers of the armed forces to Obersalzberg, the fact which could under no circumstances remain secret. It seemed to us the pinnacle of a deliberately conducted policy of bluff. So Hitler, despite the bellicose spirit of his speech, still sought a compromise. Should not this very meeting have been aimed at the last pressure on Poland? At any rate, with such thoughts, Colonel General von Rundstedt and I left Berchtesgaden. While the Colonel General went directly to our headquarters in Nisi, I stopped for a day at Liegnitz, where my family lived, another sign of how little I inwardly believed that war was about to break out. On August 24, 1939 at 12 noon, Colonel General von Rundstedt took command of the Army Group. On August 25 at 15:25 from the OK arrived a coded order. Operation Weiss, the first day, HII 26.8, for the decision to start the war, which we did not want to believe until then, was therefore made. I was sitting with Colonel General von Rundstedt in our headquarters at the Hillages Cruise Monastery in Niesetina, when at 20:30 the following order was transmitted by telephone from the OSH. It is forbidden to open hostilities. Immediately stop the troops. Mobilization continues. Deployment according to Plan Weiss and West to continue as planned. Every soldier can understand what this last-minute change in offensive orders means. The three armies on the march to the border in the area stretching from Lower Silesia to eastern Slovakia had to be stopped within a few hours. Taking into account that all headquarters, at least up to and including division headquarters, were also on the march, and that for reasons of camouflage radio communications had not yet been authorized. In spite of all the difficulties, it was still possible to transmit the order everywhere in time, a splendid achievement of the control and communication organs. One motorized regiment in eastern Slovakia, however, was held up only because an officer sent in a Fiesler Storch aircraft landed at night at the head of the regiment's column. About the reasons that prompted Hitler, apparently, at the last moment to change his decision to go to war, we learned nothing. It was only said that negotiations were still under. One can easily understand that we soldiers were unpleasantly struck by such methods of the High Command. After all, the decision to go to war is, after all, the most responsible decision of the head of state. How could such a decision be taken, only to be reversed a few hours later? First of all, it should have been taken into account that such an abrogation from the military point of view would have had dire consequences. As I have already said in describing the meeting at Obersalzberg, everything was calculated for a sudden attack on the enemy. There was no officially announced mobilization. The first day of mobilization was August 26, that is, the day of the just suspended offensive. As a consequence, the offensive was to be carried out not only by the forces of all tank and motorized formations, but also by a limited number of infantry divisions, which were partly already in the border area, partly were hastily brought to mobilization readiness. Now, a surprise attack on the enemy was out of the question, for if the advance to the concentration areas in the frontier strip was carried out at night, it could not but be known to the enemy. First of all, because the motorized units had to move out of the concentration areas west of the Oder in the daytime in order to force it. As a result, now, if it came to war at all, the second option was to come into force. An offensive by all forces brought to mobilization readiness. The moment of surprise, in any case, was lost, since it could not be assumed that Hitler had taken his first decision to launch military action ill-considered and frivolous. The only conclusion left for us was that all this was still a diplomatic tactic of constantly increasing the pressure on the enemy, when therefore on August 31 at 17 hours again arrived at the Or. HAA 1.9, 4.5 Colonel General Rundstedt and I were very skeptical. In addition, there were no reports regarding the termination of negotiations. In the Army Group compounds, just in case, taking into account the experience of August 25, everything was prepared to ensure that the advance of troops, even at the very last moment if the events are repeated, said General von Rundstedt, and I did not go to bed until midnight, waiting for what still seemed to us quite possible order to stop the advance. Only when midnight had passed and all possibility of delaying the advance had disappeared, there could be no doubt that the matter would now be decided by arms. The German command took the above-mentioned risk in the West in full, say, put up against Poland 42 cadre divisions, including a newly formed tank division, as well as a newly formed infantry division, which included units that built fortifications in the Oder-Water Arc. Total 24 infantry divisions, 3 mountain divisions, 6 armored divisions, 4 light divisions, 4 motorized infantry divisions, and 1 cavalry brigade. To this should be added another 16 divisions, staffed only after mobilization die, which, however, could not yet be considered complete. In addition, the Eastern Army was subordinated to the Leibstandarte, with 1 or 2 more reinforced as regiments. In the West, however, there remained only 11 cadre infantry divisions, fortress units up to a division in strength, and 35 divisions that had been reformed. There were no tank or motorized formations in the West, total 46 divisions. of which, however, could only be recognized as conditionally fit for combat. The 22nd Infantry Division, trained and equipped as an airborne division, remained in the OK Reserve in Germany. Most of the air force in the two air fleets was used on the Polish front, while the three air fleet, of weaker composition, remained in the west. The risk taken by the German command by such a distribution of forces was certainly very great, due to the unexpectedly rapid end of the Polish campaign, which was partly caused by the mistakes of the defeated side and, above all, the complete inaction of the Western allies, calmly watching the defeat of Poland. This risk has never been fully appreciated. It must be taken into account, however, that the German command had to reckon with a French army of some 90 divisions. Indeed, France had mobilized 108 divisions within 3 weeks in the fall of 1939. These included 57 infantry, 5 cavalry, 1 tank and 45 reserve and territorial divisions, and, in addition, large units of the RGK, including tanks and artillery. The latter had an advantage over similar German formations in that they consisted of soldiers who had completed active service, while the newly formed German units were largely composed of soldiers who had completed an incomplete course of training and reservists, veterans of the First World War. Thus, there is no question that the French army from the very first day of the war, many times superior to the German forces operating on the Western Front. The participation of the British Army in the operations of ground forces was, however, very small. Great Britain put up for this purpose only 4 divisions, but they arrived in the theatre of operations only in the first half of October. The German operational plan in the war against Poland was based on the full use of opportunities arising from the drawing of borders to cover the enemy on both flanks. The German army attacked with 2 far-flung flank groups, almost completely abandoned the action in the centre. 5 infantry corps, numbering 5 infantry corps and 1 tank corps, combining 9 cadre divisions, 8 infantry divisions formed during mobilization, 2 tank divisions, 2 motorized infantry divisions, and 1 cavalry brigade. The total, therefore, is 21 divisions. To them should be added the fortress units of Königsberg and Lützen in East Prussia, and in Pomerania, the Netz Brigade. Army Group deployed 3 armies in East Prussia and 1 army in East Pomerania. Streitkowska's Army Group was to initially strike through the corridor, then most of the forces to quickly move east of the Vistula River to the southeast, and south, and after forcing the Nera to strike in the rear of the Polish units, which, obviously, will be defending the Vistula line. Army Group South had a much larger force. It consisted of 3 armies. Army Group had a total of 8 infantry corps and 4 armoured corps, which had 15 cadre infantry divisions, 3 mountain rifle divisions, 8 newly formed divisions, as well as most of the mechanized formations, 4 armoured divisions, 4 mobile divisions, and 2 motorized infantry divisions, total 36 divisions. By the 14th Army, in the industrial area of Upper Silesia, in eastern Moravia, and in western Slovakia. By the 10th Army in the area of Kreuzberg and south of it, and the 8th Army in central Silesia east of Els. Its task was to defeat the enemy in the Great Arc of the Vistula and in Galicia, to move quickly mechanized formations to Warsaw, and as quickly as possible on a wide front to capture the crossings across the Vistula, in order to defeat the remnants of the Polish army in cooperation with Army Group North. So Poland had in peacetime 30 infantry divisions, 11 cavalry brigades, 1 mountain brigade and 2 mechanized brigades. In addition, there were several border guard regiments, a large number of national defense battalions and marine units located in the Jiedingen-Wentila area. In all, the Polish armed forces thus constituted a relatively large force. However, the armament of the Polish army belonged mainly to the period of the First World War. The aviation, which numbered about 1,000 airplanes, was also not up to modern requirements. The air defense was insufficient. The German side believed that Poland would double the number of its divisions in the event of war, although it seemed doubtful whether the armament needed for this was fully available. According to von Tippel-Skirch, Poland had only formed regiments and other units for 10 reserve divisions in 1939 before the outbreak of war. However, it appears that it was not possible to consolidate all these units into the divisions they were to be part of. Nevertheless, during this campaign, a number of reserve divisions were mentioned in the information the German side had about the enemy. The above-mentioned forces were distributed by the Polish Army Command as follows. along the border of East Prussia in front of the Beaver, narrow Vistula frontier, a task force of 2 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades was to operate between Suwałki and Lomża, on both sides of Malor, Modlin army consisting of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades. In the corridor was concentrated Pomeranian army consisting of 5 divisions and 1 cavalry brigade. In front of the German border from the water to the Slovakian border, 3 armies were to operate. An army in the western part of the province of Poznan, consisting of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades. Lod's army in the Wielan area, consisting of 4 divisions and 2 cavalry brigades. Krakow army between Częstochowa and Neumarkt, consisting of 6 divisions, 1 cavalry brigade and 1 motorized brigade. In behind the latter 2 armies, the Prussian army was concentrated in the Tomazow-Kielce area, with 6 divisions and 1 cavalry brigade. Finally, the Carpathian army, consisting mainly of reserve units and national defence battalions, had the task of covering the deep flank along the Carpathians from Tarnow to Lemberg in a deeply echeloned formation. The reserve group consisting of 3 divisions and 1 motorized brigade remained on the Vistula in the area of Modlin, Warsaw, Lublin. In addition, already during the campaign east of the Bug was formed a special Poleskaya group, apparently to ensure against Russian attack. But when the German offensive began, the deployment of forces of the Polish army was not yet completed, and apparently the above plan was only partially realized. It is perhaps difficult to ascertain what was the operational intent behind the plan for the deployment of a Polish army, unless it was the desire to cover everything, or perhaps it would be more correct to say, to give up nothing voluntarily. This desire, if realized, leads the weakest side, as a rule, to defeat. This conclusion, a few years later, Hitler would also have to draw, although he never gave himself credit for it. The complexity of the operational situation for Poland, caused by the possibility of a German offensive from 2, and later even from 3 directions, and the relative weakness of the Polish armed forces, was itself clear enough. If the command of the Polish army nevertheless decided to attempt to cover everything, this only shows how difficult it seems to take into account military factors when psychological and political considerations come to the fore. In Poland, with the exception of Marshal Pilsudski and a few other sober-minded politicians, apparently no one ever clearly realized the danger of the position in which the country found itself as a result of the satisfaction of unjust territorial claims against its neighbors, Russia and Germany. Poland had only 35 million inhabitants, of whom, again, only 22 million were Poles, while the rest belonged to the German, Ukrainian, Belarusian and Jewish minorities, who were, without exception, oppressed to a greater or lesser degree. At the same time, Poland, which had relied on an alliance with France during the years of German military weakness, had apparently indulged too long in dreams of a possible attack on Germany. Some were going to make a sudden attack on isolated East Prussia, or, as the Polish Insurgent Union advocated, on German Upper Silesia. Others were even going to undertake a march on Berlin, whether by the shortest route through Poznan and Frankfurt on the Oder, after the capture of Upper Silesia, by striking west of the Oder to the capital of the empire. It is true that such dreams became unfounded already, as a result of the construction of German fortifications on the Oder water arc, and later as a result of the arming of Germany. However, aggressive plans of this kind had not yet completely disappeared from the minds of Polish political and military leaders, for they hoped for a simultaneous French offensive in the west. In any case, the above-described plan of deployment of the Polish army, although it was at first designed in general terms for defense, allowed the assumption that it left open at the same time the possibility at a later stage, as soon as France came to the rescue, of launching an offensive. The Polish General Staff did not yet have its own military doctrine backed by years of experience. Generally speaking, the Polish temperament was more suited to the idea of offensive than to defense. The romantic notions of bygone times, at least subconsciously, still held sway in the minds of Polish soldiers. I recall a painting showing Marshal Ryd-Smigli against a background of attacking Polish cavalry squadrons. On the other hand, the newly created Polish army learned from the French. From them, it could hardly have received the impetus for rapid, flexible control of operations. Rather, it could have borrowed the experience of positional warfare, which had become dominant in the minds of French commanders since the First World War. Thus, it is possible that the Polish army's deployment plan, apart from the desire to give nothing away, was based on no clear operational idea at all. There was only a compromise between the need to defend against superior enemy forces and previous arrogant offensive plans. At the same time, fell into the delusion of believing that the Germans would conduct the offensive on the French model and that it would soon assume the stale forms of positional warfare. Interesting in this connection is a secret report, which we received shortly before the outbreak of the war, that the Poles were allegedly going to take an offensive. It came from a source considered until then to be very reliable, a person in the immediate entourage of the President of Poland, Marshal Rydz-Śmigło, Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Army. So the message stated that the Poles were about to launch an offensive, deploying large forces in the Poznan province. Most remarkable, however, was the fact that these plans, as reported, were allegedly drawn up at the suggestion or demand of Great Britain. In the prevailing situation at the time, this news seemed to us highly improbable. It is true that later we received confirmation that the Poles had indeed concentrated a relatively large force in the Poznan province, although a German attack on Poznan would have been the least dangerous for them. The Poznan army was destined to end its existence in a battle on the banks of the Jura. On the other hand, Poland had no shortage of sober-minded advisers. As Colonel Hermann Schneider writes in the journal Militärwissenschaftliche Rundschau of 1942, French General Weygand proposed to move the defence behind the line Niemen, Beaver, Nauru, Vistula, San. This proposal from the operational point of view was the only correct one, because it excluded the possibility of being covered by Germany and at the same time provided much better opportunities for defence on the river frontiers against German tank formations. In addition, this line stretched only 600 kilometres in contrast to the large arc of 1,800 kilometres, which formed the Polish border from Suwałki to the passes through the Carpathians. But acceptance of this proposal would have meant giving up the whole of western Poland with its most valuable industrial and agricultural areas. It is hardly conceivable that any Polish government would have held out after making such a decision. Moreover, a withdrawal of so great a distance obviously could not have favoured the French decision to attack in the west, and it is not clear whether the surrender of the whole of western Poland to the Germans would not have aroused the desire of the Soviets to secure their immediate share in eastern Poland. Consequently, as Colonel Schneider reports, General Koczyba, director of the Polish Military Academy, in a memorandum which he sent in early 1938 to Marshal Rydz-Śmigło, found another solution. He insisted that it was impossible to give up the main strategic backbone of Poland, to which he included both the industrial areas of Lodz and Upper Silesia, and the important agricultural areas of Poznan, Kuzno and Kielce. He therefore proposed a deployment plan, which in its main features coincided with the plan carried out in 1939, although it provided for the abandonment of the defence of the corridor and the Poznan province west of the water. A large number of fortifications were to be built to strengthen the defence of Poland, both south of the border with East Prussia and in a great arc from Grodno to Poznan, as well as on the Silesian border from Ostrow through Czerkesto-Koł to the Teschen area. At the same time, however, it was intended to leave an offensive gate through which it was planned to strike at East and West Prussia as well as Silesia. The fact that the construction of sufficiently powerful fortifications on such a large scale would have been beyond Poland's capabilities is quite obvious. General Koczyba, however, recognized that Poland was inferior to Germany as regards its military strength. As for French aid, he was sober about it, believing that Poland would be left to herself during the first 6-8 weeks, even if France provided active military aid in full, and that she would be left to her own devices. Therefore, he envisaged a strategic defence along the leading edge of the above-mentioned backbone, within which reserves for subsequent decisive operations should be concentrated. As has already been said, the deployment carried out by Poland in 1939 was in many respects identical with the general's proposal. It is true that the latter proposed to concentrate the main effort in the Thorn-Bromberg-Gneisenau area, whereas in 1939 one could rather speak of two such areas, one along the borders of East Prussia and the other against Silesia. The deployment of the Polish army in 1939, which was intended to cover everything, including the corridor area and the Poznan province, which was prominent, could only lead to defeat in view of the above-described possibilities of German coverage and its superior military power. How, however, was Poland to act at all to avoid it? First of all, a decision had to be made whether to give up only the strategic backbone mentioned by General Kotschiba, or, in consequence of the coverage from East Prussia, Silesia and Slovakia, to give up the Polish army together with it. This was the same question which in 1943-1944 I repeatedly asked Hitler when he demanded of me to hold the Donetsk area, the Dnieper Arc, etc. The answer that Poland had to give, in my opinion, was clear. The Polish command had to strive first of all to ensure that under all circumstances the Polish army would be able to hold out until the advance of the Western powers forced Germany to pull back her main forces from the Polish theatre of operations. Even if it seemed at first that the loss of industrial areas precluded the possibility of a long war, it had to be considered that the preservation of the Polish field army created the possibility of their return in the future. But under no circumstances could the Polish army be allowed to be surrounded west of the Vistula, or on either side of it. For Poland, the only way out was to gain time. A rigid defence could be organised, of course, only behind the line Borbay, Narrow Vistula, San, and on the southern flank it was possible to extend defensive positions as far as the Danube in order to preserve the central industrial area of Poland between the Vistula and the San. Above all, it was necessary to prevent the coverage from East Prussia and Western Slovakia. For this purpose it was necessary to occupy in the north the line Barba-Naru. Vistula up to the fortress of Modlin or Visegrad, it represented a strong natural barrier. In addition, the former Russian fortifications, although outdated, were good strongholds. In addition, from East Prussia, if it was possible to expect a blow from there, could attack only relatively small German tank. In the south, it was important to prevent deep coverage by defending the passes through the Carpathians. Both of these tasks, however, could be accomplished with small forces. The deployment of the Polish army in front of the Barba-Naru line was as much a mistake as the fact that large forces were moved into the corridor and the Poznan province, which stood out in front. If, according to the plan described above, the northern and southern flanks had been fully secured against deep German coverage, it would have been possible to fight a largely maneuver war in western Poland. It had to be realized that the main blow of the German army was to be expected from the direction of Silesia. This idea could be arrived at first, because the railroad and road network allowed here to concentrate large forces faster than in Pomerania, or even more so in East Prussia, and secondly because the direction of the blow to Warsaw was from an operational point of view the least favourable, because here it was necessary to make a frontal strike, and therefore it was the least realistic. The main forces of the Polish army should not, as happened in 1939, have been concentrated near the frontier. They should have been concentrated at such a distance from it that the direction of the main blow of the German army could be established in time. In doing so, it would have been important to keep the forces in the area of the corridor and in the Poznan province as small as possible, to concentrate the main forces in the Silesian direction, from where the main blow was expected to come, and above all to have sufficient operational reserves. If plans for an offensive against Germany had not been cherished in Poland for too long, the reinforced former German fortifications along the Vistula, at the Graudenthorn line, would at least have delayed the joining of German forces advancing from Pomerania and East Prussia. So strengthening of the Poznan area would also have limited the freedom of manoeuvre of German forces in that province. It should also be noted that the plan to launch counterattacks in the north or south of western Poland, depending on the situation, using internal communications, was practically unfeasible. For such operations, the available space was too small, and the Polish railroad network did not have sufficient capacity. In addition, it had to be taken into account that the movement of large masses of troops could very soon be disrupted by German aircraft and German tank formations. Thus, there was nothing else to do but from the very beginning to move the defensive positions behind the line Borbay, Neru Vistula, San, and possibly the Dunajec, and fight ahead of it only to gain time, with the main forces should be concentrated from the beginning against Silesia, and the northern and southern flanks at the same time had to be secured from the coverage discussed above. No one will venture to assert that in this way Poland could, in the end, have avoided defeat if as was the case, the Western powers had left Poland all alone, but in any case the plan described above would have prevented the overturning of the Polish army in the borderland, which resulted in the Polish command being unable to ensure either an organized resistance on the Vistula Arc or a withdrawal of the army beyond the boundary of the rivers mentioned above in order to organize a stable defense. Poland could, as we have already said, from the very beginning fight only to gain time. To oppose the German offensive, preferably behind the said river boundary, until the offensive in the west forced the Germans to withdraw from Poland, was the only objective to be pursued. Hence, however, it also follows that the Polish military command had to make it absolutely clear to the leaders of the state that without a firm pledge by the Western powers to launch an all-out offensive in the West, immediately after the outbreak of war, it was impossible to enter into war with Germany. In view of the decisive influence which the Polish commander-in-chief, Marshal Smigli, then exerted on the activities of the government, it could not pass over such a warning. It had to intervene in time to resolve the question of Danzig and the corridor, if only to delay the outbreak of war with Germany. Our troops in 1940 captured in France a letter with which General Gamelin, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in the West, addressed the Polish military attaché in Paris on September 10, 1939. The letter is evidently a reply to a Polish inquiry as to when effective aid would be given to Poland. General Gamelin writes on this occasion for transmission to Marshal Smigli, more than half of our cadre divisions in the northeast are engaged in fighting. Since crossing the border, the Germans have been giving us stubborn resistance. Nevertheless, we have advanced. However, we are fighting a positional war with the enemy prepared for defense, and I do not yet have all the necessary artillery. From the beginning of the campaign began air operations in conjunction with the operations of ground forces. We have the impression that a significant part of the German Air Force is acting against us. Therefore, I believe that I fulfilled ahead of schedule my promise to start the main forces of the offensive on the 15th day, after the first day of the announcement of mobilization in France. I could not have done more. Consequently, Poland did indeed have in her hands the promise of the French side. The only question was whether the Polish military command could have been satisfied with the promise to launch an offensive with the main forces only on the 15th day. Events, at any rate, showed that this promise did not at all provide Poland with quick and effective help. So Poland's defeat was the inevitable consequence of the illusions which Warsaw had harboured about the actions of the Allies, as well as of the overestimation of its own forces from the point of view of the possibility of sustained resistance. When our troops crossed the Polish border at dawn on September 1, 1939, we at Army Group Headquarters were naturally at our workplaces in the monastery of Geliges Kruz in Niesice. The monastery, where the Catholic missionaries were being trained, was located outside the city, and, owing to its remoteness from population centres, its spaciousness, and the very simple decoration of the study rooms and cells, was an extremely practical building for the higher headquarters in wartime. The Spartan existence of its ordinary inhabitants, who had ceded part of the buildings to us, coloured our lives accordingly, and our commandant of the headquarters, although he had previously served in Munich's Levenbräu beer house, showed no inclination to spoil us. Naturally, like all soldiers, we received army supplies. Nothing bad could be said about the soldiers' soup from the field kitchen, but the fact that we received only soldiers' bread and hard smoked sausage for dinner day after day, which was quite difficult for the older of us to chew, was probably not absolutely necessary. Fortunately, the monks sometimes added some salad or vegetables from their vegetable garden. From time to time, the abbot would visit the commander and his closest aides, and would tell us very entertaining stories about the selfless work of the missionaries in distant lands. We were doubly glad to hear these stories, as they helped us at least for a short time to distract ourselves from the questions related to the fulfillment of our tasks. In the early morning of September 1, our conversations, of course, came to an end. The war began to dispose of us. If we were at our workplaces so early that morning, it was due to a sense of the need to be on the alert from the moment our troops came into contact with the enemy, not to the combat situation. We knew, of course, that it would be hours before we received important reports from our subordinate armies. These hours are remembered by all who worked in the higher headquarters, hours when everything goes its own way and one can only wait to see how events will unfold. The frontline soldier knows about the enormous tension associated with the beginning of the offensive, when on the watch of the platoon commander the hand moves forward second by second, and finally comes the moment of throwing into the attack, which relieves all tension. But from that moment a frontline soldier is seized by the impressions of battle and makes him forget everything else. In the headquarters, on the other hand, the higher up, the more the time of tense waiting begins. Inquiries from subordinate staffs. What's the situation? are rightly disliked by them and can only give the impression of nervousness. Therefore, it is better to wait it out. At the same time, everyone has long since come to the conclusion that the saying bad news comes quickly is not relevant to military events. If the offensive is suspended, the front is usually silent, either because of damage to communication lines or because they want to wait until better news can be passed on. Thus, the tension only subsides when the first reports arrive, regardless of whether they are bad or good. Until then, and our motto has been, wait till our expectations be justified by the troops, on the preparation of which we have put so much effort and labour, but however in too short a time. Will the large tank formations, the organisation and use of which represented something completely new, justify the hopes placed on them by their creator, General Guderian, and together with him and all of us? Will the German command, and especially the Army Group Command, be able to carry out the intended operational plan and achieve complete victory? To destroy the enemy even before reaching the Vistula line and thereby avert the threatening danger of simultaneous warfare on two fronts. These were the questions that worried us in those hours of waiting and uncertainty. Army Group North, after establishing communication between the troops, striking from Pomerania and East Prussia, and forced the Polish troops to retreat from the corridor, in the framework of the planned covering maneuver from the territory of East Prussia and Silesia, had the opportunity to cover the flank of the enemy, crossing the Vistula, and go to the rear of his main forces located on the Great Vistula Arc. Group South had the task of actions of both advancing armies from Silesia to force the enemy to accept the battle still in the Vistula Arc and prevent his withdrawal behind the line Vistula. For this purpose, we attempted to strike a blow gathered in a fist of tank units of the 10th Army, which should be followed as soon as possible by infantry divisions to overturn the enemy, apparently concentrating near the border, and, ahead of him, to seize the crossings across the Vistula from Demblin to Warsaw. Further, it was important that the 14th Army advancing through Galicia as quickly as possible came to the San River and forced it. If the enemy intended to make the main resistance only behind the borders of the San and the Vistula, the 14th Army could break the entire enemy defence along the river borders with a blow from the south and join deep in the enemy's rear with the eastern flank of Army Group advancing from the north. The 14th Army had the task to threaten the deep flank of Polish troops, concentrating in the Krakow area with its deeply echeloned flank, extended into eastern Slovakia, and thus eliminate the possibility of a long defence of western Galicia. The headquarters of Army Group South directed operations in Poland in the spirit of this operational plan. He was at all times striving to force the main forces of the Polish army to take the battle even before reaching the Vistula River and defeat them. At the same time, however, he took into account the possibility of preempting the enemy in case he tried to make the main resistance only behind the line San Vistula. Instead of a sequential description of the operations, however important such an account of the events of this lightning war may seem, I should like to confine myself to conveying in outline its most significant moments. Some of these events occurred at the same time, others sequentially. The general picture is as follows. Heavy frontier fighting followed by a rapid pursuit of the defeated enemy by the 14th Army in Galicia, which brought it to Lemberg and beyond the San River. The breakthrough of the 10th Army to the Vistula and the battle with the encircled enemy near Radom. The Battle of the Bezura, during which the largest enemy group was defeated by the forces of the 8th and 10th Armies under the direct leadership of the Army Group headquarters. The attack on Warsaw and, finally, the final battles, which were the result of delayed negotiations on the conclusion of an agreement between the leading political figures of Germany and the Soviets, who had entered eastern Poland and crossed the Polish border on September 17, 1939. The immediate task of the 14th Army was to encircle the large enemy forces, which, according to our information, were in western Galicia, in the area of Krakow. Deep envelopment of the enemy was already started by the forces of this army from Upper Silesia, through the area of Moravian Ostrava in the direction of the Carpathians, while the 8th Army was to break through the strong Polish fortifications in the eastern part of Upper Silesia in order to strike further north of the Vistula River to Warsaw. The 17th Army was to strike from Moravia south of the Vistula River to Krakow. The task of the other two corps, the 22nd Army Corps, which struck from the Orava Valley crossing the western Carpathians from the south to Krakow, and the 18th Mountain Corps, which struck east of the High Tatras through the Poprad and Nej Sandek valleys to Bochnia, in order to break through and get to the rear of the enemy in the Krakow area, was to get to the flank and rear of the enemy expected in the Krakow area. Further to the east, through the Dukla Pass, known from the First World War, Slovak troops were to strike, which the OK authorized to use later. The tradition-rich 1 Bavarian Mountain Division and 2 reserve divisions were also later to take part in the fighting on this flank. The first battles that the 14th Army, in particular the 8th AK, for the Polish border fortifications, were quite difficult for us. But its fate of this border battle was decided in operational terms covering manoeuvre from the Carpathian Mountains, although in the true sense of the word, the planned encirclement of the enemy grouping in the Krakow area could not be implemented, because the enemy, realizing the threat to him, left western Galicia, but his main forces were nevertheless defeated already in these first battles, and mainly in the course of the rapid pursuit after these battles, during which 22 TK managed to cut off the way of the retreating enemy. Thus, the right flank of the army, the Mountain Corps and 17 ACE advanced to the area of Lemberg and the fortress of Peremysol, which were taken by our troops. The rest of the enemy forces that had retreated to eastern Galicia and his reserves that were there were destroyed in these battles, with the exception of those troops that fled to Romania. The left flank of the Army Tank Corps, 8 AC, and attached to it Army Group 7 ACU, forced the San above the place of its confluence with the Vistula. In the battles against the bravely defending enemy, which in some areas were persistent, were defeated, and enemy units, approaching partly from Warsaw, partly from the area of Army Group North. Far in the rear of the Vistula front, the eastern flank of Army Group joined the troops of our Army Group. On September 15, with the occupation of Lemberg and Peremysol, the pursuit was largely completed, although in this area and east of San were still fighting to destroy the remaining Polish units. If in the basis of the task of the 14th Army, along with the destruction of the enemy's forces in western Galicia, was laid the plan of parallel pursuit of the enemy, which should have prevented any of his attempts to stop to organize the defense behind the Vistula, so the task of both armies advancing from Silesia was to force the enemy to take a decisive battle before reaching the Vistula line. In this case, the stronger 10th Army, which had tank formations, was assigned an important task: to break through the enemy's front and reach the Vistula, while the weaker 8th Army was to provide the northern flank of the troops involved in this operation from the enemy's strikes, located, according to our data, in the area of Kalisz, Lodz, and in the Poznan province. 10th Army came from Upper Silesia. Its left flank was striking from the area of Kreisberg. The army had 4 corps in the first echelon. In the first echelon followed 15 corps, 4 AC, 16 TK, and 11 AC. 14 corps division followed in the second echelon. Following the army, as a reserve of the Army Group, followed the 7th Army, as well as 62 PD. The 8th Army had the task to strike at Lodz in a deeply echeloned formation. It consisted of 2 corps, the 13th Army and the 10th Army. This army was also followed by 2 divisions as a reserve of the Army Group. Soon after the armies crossed the border at dawn on September 1, 1939, fierce fighting ensued, during which the enemy was knocked out of his positions. Whether, however, he would still attempt to take the decisive battle on this side of the Vistula, or whether he had before him the aim of buying time and sought to withdraw his troops behind the Vistula, was for the next few days a great mystery to us. So far, at any rate, it has become clear that strong groups of the enemy are concentrated in the mountainous area of Lyzagora, in the area of Kielce, Radom and Lodz. To the fighting in the first week of the war were apparently 2 factors that first came forward in this campaign. So first of them was the breakthrough of the enemy's front by the tank formations that had struck a deep blow in the rear, for the simultaneous movement with which, however, the infantry divisions had to strain all their strength. Another factor was that the enemy aviation, as a result of the successful actions of the German aviation, was almost completely paralyzed, which also applied to the control, communications and means of communication. Thus, the enemy never managed to provide centralized control of operations. The headquarters of our group of troops, based on the available data about the enemy, set 2 tasks for the 10th Army. The right flank group, which included 15 corps and 14 AC, as well as 7 AC transferred to it by the Army Group, was to strike at the enemy, concentrating in the area of Radom, and break it. The left flank group, consisting of 16 TK and 14 Corps, as well as 11 AC, was to try to block the Lodz grouping of the enemy to withdraw to Warsaw, while the 8th Army was to strike at this grouping from the west. In the course of accomplishing this task, the 10th Army at first managed to impose a battle on the enemy grouping in the area of Radom in the wooded area of Lysa Gora, while the 15th Corps advanced between this grouping and the Vistula crossings at Opatu and Deblin, and the 14th Corps, acting as part of the northern grouping, manoeuvred to block the enemy's way to Warsaw as well. On September 9, the first cauldron of this war, in which the enemy army found itself, was true in the area of Kielce. Radom fighting continued until September 12, as the enemy not only resisted stubbornly, but also continuously tried to break the ring around him, but nothing could be changed in the fate of this grouping. When the battle was over, we had 60,000 prisoners and 130 guns in our hands. 7 divisions of the enemy were defeated during these battles. Even if the enemy had managed to save himself by withdrawing behind the Vistula, he would not have escaped this fate, for on the day when the Battle of Radom was over, the 1st Mountain Division of the 14th Army was already near Lemberg, and the left flank of this army had long ago forced the San in its lower reaches, and thus was able to break the enemy's defences, which the latter was going to organise, obviously, on the banks of the Vistula. Meanwhile, the left flank grouping of the 10th Army, as a result of fighting, came to the crossing of the Vistula River at Górka Warja, south of Warsaw, and the tank division, operating in its composition, fought on the southwestern outskirts of Warsaw. To capture this large city adapted for defence, these forces, however, were too small. The tank division had to be withdrawn from the city. At any rate, as a result of this, the enemy was cut off the way to Warsaw from the west. While our armies were moving towards San and the Vistula, the army group headquarters was transferred to Lubliniec, a former garrison town of the German Lancers, which was not particularly famous in the old army. This time we were housed in a house for deaf mutes, and I do not mean at all to say that we ever pretended to be deaf mutes. On the contrary, we listened attentively to all reports from the troops and, on the other hand, did not stop to communicate our point of view clearly to higher authorities. The latter does not mean that during the Polish campaign we did not agree with the OK on major issues. Despite this, there was sometimes a divergence of our points of view. However, Colonel General von Rundstedt did not allow any interference in the command of the army group. The building of the home for the deaf-mute, as one might imagine, was not constructed so that its walls would absorb sound. In consequence, the voice of our Chief of Intelligence, whom no persuasion could induce to speak more softly, was heard far away. The situation was thus thoroughly known throughout the headquarters. The more impressive was the skill with which he dealt with the original guests who came to us in Lubliniec. One day we had a famous film actress and director, accompanied by an entourage of cameramen, who declared that she was following in the footsteps of the Führer. She said that on Hitler's instructions she had come to the front to make a movie. Such activity, and even under the direction of a woman, was frankly extremely unpleasant for us soldiers. But it was Hitler's assignment. However, she looked like a very nice and masculine woman, like an elegant partisan who ordered a suit on the Rue de Rivoli in Paris. Her beautiful, fiery mane-like hair, which lay down in waves, framed an interesting face with close-set eyes. She wore a sort of tunic, breeches, and tall soft boots. A pistol hung from the leather belt that crossed her bosom above her hips. A knife, jammed in the Bavarian manner behind her shin, was also a weapon for close combat. The staff, as I must confess, was somewhat stunned by the appearance of such an unusual figure. I therefore first directed her to Colonel General von Rundstedt so that she could inform him of her assignment. He, as befitted a gallant cavalier, received her very kindly, but soon directed her again to me. I had no choice but to pass her on command. Thus she found herself in the possession of our rough-voiced Chief of Intelligence, whose functions also included everything connected with propaganda. This officer, a wonderful, splashing humour Bavarian, did not follow in my footsteps. He treated the matter, disregarding the actress's lavish costume, in a purely official, dry and sober manner. He received the lady extremely correctly, listened to her case, checked the documents belonging to her and her companions, then picked up the phone and called the medical officer. Putting the receiver on the lever, he said in a business-like tone, "You need to be immunized first. I've summoned a doctor. Please undress." In our guest's favour was the fact that she did not boil over, but only laughed and refused to be inoculated. Only her movie companions were to undergo this procedure, or rather one cameraman. He approached, flaunting his brown tan. The doctor brought the syringe, and the unfortunate man immediately fainted in front of the gloating spectators. The chief of intelligence had the brilliant idea of directing this expedition to General von Reichenau, who knew the lady well and seemed a suitable patron. She went with her entourage to the headquarters of the 10th Army at Konski. Soon, however, she returned from there. During the occupation of Konski, there had been several skirmishes in which civilians also took part. Due to the nervousness of an anti-aircraft officer, senseless firing was opened in the market square, where many people had gathered, and an unjustified panic arose, causing many casualties. The movie group witnessed this regrettable scene, and our guest, shocked by what happened, decided to return. As for the officer responsible for the scene, General von Reichenau immediately put him on trial before a military tribunal, which sentenced him, on the charge of involuntary manslaughter, to forfeiture of his officer rank and imprisonment for several years. This example shows that strict measures were immediately taken by the command authorities of the land forces in such cases. These measures, unfortunately later, at the beginning of the Russian campaign, led Hitler to deprive the courts of military tribunal of the right to try cases involving civilians. While the fighting was still going on in the Radom area, although here the victorious conclusion of the battle was already in sight, the northern flank of the army group, due to the initiative shown here by the enemy, took the main place in the activities of the group headquarters. During the first 9 days of the campaign, all actions proceeded so smoothly and in accordance with our wishes that, as could be thought, it was unlikely that anything could seriously disrupt or change the plan of intended operation. Nevertheless, in these days I had a vague premonition that on the northern flank of the army group something brewed. After all, it was clear that the enemy had concentrated in Poznan province large forces, which have not yet taken part in the fighting. In view of this, on September 8 and 9, I repeatedly drew the attention of the Chief of Staff of the 8th Army to the fact that the army should be particularly careful in conducting reconnaissance on its northern flank, as a result of our inquiries to the OK regarding the location of the Poznan group. On September 9, we received a telegram from the OK stating that the enemy was rapidly withdrawing the Poznan grouping to the east, and that therefore no threat to the 8th Army's deep flank should be feared. However, we still assumed that south of the Vistula, between Lodz and Warsaw, a total of another 10 divisions of the enemy. It should be recalled that the army group planned to forces of the 10th Army to block the way to Warsaw, concentrated, according to our data, in the area of Lodz, a large group of the enemy, while the 8th Army at the same time had to strike at this group from the west. In this case, the original task of this army, which was to ensure the entire course of the operation on the northern flank of a deeply echeloned structure, of course remained in force. Apparently, however, the views of the headquarters of the 8th Army were more focused on the fulfillment of the first of the tasks, set then to the north. In any case, on September 10 in the morning from the Army headquarters received a report that the 30th Division of its composition was suddenly attacked by significantly superior enemy forces from the north. The situation here took on the character of a crisis. Attempts of the army to restore the situation by counterattacks were not successful. However, the army command hoped that it would be able to stop the enemy. It was certainly a large force, mainly transferred from the Poznan province, and for this purpose ordered both of its corps to take the defense front to the north. Nevertheless, the army command asked for an urgent transfer of a tank corps to its disposal to prevent an enemy breakthrough in a southerly direction to Lodz, which was occupied without a fight on September 9. The Army Group headquarters, however, was by no means going to restore the 8th Army's position by sending it reinforcements. Even if there would be a local crisis here, perhaps even a severe one, it was of no importance from the operational point of view. And on the contrary, it gave us in our hands a chance to turn it into a major victory. After all, now large enemy forces were drawn into the battle west of the Vistula, and it could only end in their defeat if, of course, the German side would act correctly. So the Army Group headquarters rejected the request of the command of the 8th Army to send reinforcements in the tank corps. Instead, it proceeded to encircle the enemy. From the west, at this time, just approached the 2 divisions that were in reserve of the Army Group and followed the 8th Army. They were thrown against the western flank of the enemy, attacking the 8th Army from the north. For the same purpose was allocated 1 light division, which participated in the approaching end of the Battle of Radom. The main task, which was set by the Army Group headquarters, was to force the enemy in front of the 8th Army front to fight with a constantly changing front. For this purpose, the headquarters gave the order that the 10th Army immediately turn to the west, standing near Warsaw and south of it 16T Key, as well as the following 11A Key, which received the task to take part in the battle conducted by the 8th Army, entering it from the east. The 8th Army itself was tasked to repel the ongoing enemy attacks, and as soon as they begin to weaken, to go on the offensive. Impressions that remained at Colonel General von Rundstedt and me during a visit to the headquarters of the 8th Army in these days forced the headquarters of the Army Group to take the leadership of this operation in their own hands. The actions of both advancing from the East and Southeast Corps of the 10th Army was entrusted to General von Reichenau himself, while the headquarters of the 8th Army was left to direct the actions of his two corps, fighting on the front to the north, and the coverage of the enemy from the west. Finally, to complete the encirclement at the request of the Army Group Command from the Army Group North, which forced the Vistula from the north in the rear of the enemy, was also allocated 3AC. When in the course of the battle revealed an attempt of large enemy forces to withdraw along the Vistula bank to the fortress of Modlin, the headquarters of the Army Group assigned the 15th Corps, which had previously operated in the area of the task of cutting off the enemy and this last route of retreat. After fierce fighting and attempts of the enemy to break through first to the south, and then to the southeast and finally to the east on September 18, his resistance was finally broken. By September 20, the 10th Army had captured 80,000 prisoners, 320 guns, 130 airplanes and 40 tanks. The 8th Army captured 90,000 prisoners and a huge amount of military equipment. In these battles were defeated 9 enemy infantry divisions, 3 cavalry brigades and partially another 10 divisions, therefore much more compounds than we expected. The Battle of Bezura was the largest independent operation of the Polish campaign, its culminating, if not decisive, moment. From the operational point of view, this decisive moment was the already deep coverage of the entire Polish army by Army Group North from the north and the 14th Army from the south, showing whether this single major counterattack of the command of the Polish army was dictated by the hope of changing the course of the battle in the Vistula Arc, or whether it pursued only one aim, to pierce the way to Warsaw for the Polish troops south of Warsaw. It could not change anything in the fate of the Polish army. If the Battle of Bezura cannot be compared in its results with the battles of destruction of the encircled enemy conducted later in Russia, it is the largest battle of its kind that had taken place up to that time. This battle could not have been planned in advance as a result of the breakthrough of the enemy's front by large tank formations. It arose as a result of counterattacks carried out on the German side in a situation which, due to the enemy's actions, suddenly created great opportunities for us. Army Group Headquarters to provide overall leadership of operations of the 10th and 8th Armies was transferred to the Ring. For Colonel General von Rundstedt and myself, the places where both armies were now operating were familiar lands. The Colonel General had been at one time an officer of the General Staff under the Governor General of Warsaw in the First World War, and therefore knew almost all of Poland. I myself, in the late fall of 1914, participated as a senior adjutant of the 2nd Guards, Reserve Regiment in the offensive from Upper Silesia to the Vistula, in heavy fighting at the fortress of Ivangorod, and in the retreat to the border of Upper Silesia. The settlements for which the 10th Army fought, the mountains in the area of Lisagora, and the Vistula Valley remained in my memory. When we now drove from Lublin to Kielce, passed through the battlefield near Katowice, where I was severely wounded on the night of November 16-17, 1914, and was saved only thanks to the help of my brave comrades. It was quite an unusual case. The 1st Guards Reserve Division, which included our regiment, which was part of Field Marshal von Vorsch's corps, after the withdrawal from the Vistula river banks took up the defence at the border of Upper Silesia, we were expecting an attack of the enemy forces pressing upon us, possessing an overwhelming superiority of forces. In front of only our regiment were detected parts of 2 Caucasian corps. In this atmosphere, in the evening of November 16, 1914, the news of Mackenzie's victory at Kutno came unexpectedly. At the same time, Russian radiograms were intercepted, according to which the enemy, apparently, as a result of the strike, intended to start a withdrawal on our front as well. By order of the division commander, a pursuit detachment of up to a battalion was created in each regiment with the task of pursuing the enemy during the night. I asked my commander for permission to take part in the operation as adjutant of the battalion we had hastily formed. Having a somewhat grumpy character, Colonel von Kramer very reluctantly gave his consent. Unfortunately, circumstances turned out differently than we expected. The intercepted radiograms turned out to be false. The Russians did not think about withdrawal at all. Therefore, our battalion at Katowice encountered a defensive position, which we, believing that we were dealing with a rear guard, tried to attack. When we had already reached the enemy's trenches, the battalion commander, the deeply respected Major von Baswitz, myself and the standard bearer with the unfurled banner were in front. The Russians came out to meet us, but not with raised hands, but with shouts of hurrah, and with bayonets drawn. In the melee, I was struck by a shot and fell. My opponent fell on me, but before he could finish me off, one of our guardsmen, who were rushing to my aid, killed the enemy lying on top of me. Another bullet struck me in the knee. At this time, Basowitz shouted to me that he, too, was wounded. 2 guardsmen picked him up and carried him back, but all 3 of them were struck dead by bullets on the way. The standard bearer, however, disappeared with the banner. As I learned later, he, being also badly wounded, fell into a Russian trench together with the banner. Non-commissioned officer von Haupt, one of my former recruits, then saved the banner by retrieving it from there. I heard about it even before 2 comrades. I was no longer able to move, carried me away. When I arrived at our regimental headquarters in the morning, the commander met me with encouraging words. This is what came out of your scheme. When now, 25 years later, I saw the familiar battlefield in the daytime, these memories resurfaced in my mind. The picture of the attacking battalion, the fluttering banner, the bright flashes of fire when shots were fired, the unpleasant sound of enemy shells bursting nearby. Above all, however, I remembered my comrades who, risking their lives, had helped me, the right hand of him who had protected me at that hour. Another incident happened to me during this or some other journey. While passing through Czeszczo, Colonel General von Rundstedt, and I visited the church in which the famous Black Madonna, apparently most venerated in Poland, is installed. It's the bright light of countless candles, their fine honeyed fragrance, the sumptuous gold-trimmed altar, and before it a kneeling, devoutly praying crowd. From time to time, out of the semi-darkness came the mystical cry of a praying man asking for help. Here the people prayed for victory. Mothers for their sons, just as our people and all of us did. In Kielce, our headquarters was housed in the former palace of a Polish prince. Although it had long served as the residence of the voivodeship, time-honoured bureaucracy had failed to sweep away the remnants of former luxury. Thick walls with deep window niches, overlooking the city around the ancient palace, beautiful ceilings, vaults and fireplaces spoke of a time when splendour and luxury reigned supreme. In the small room which we had chosen for the dining room of the operations department of our headquarters, a large oil-painted portrait of Pilsudski's successor, Marshal Reid Smigler, hung as a symbol of the new Poland, in a majestic pose, with a silver marshal's staff in his hand, which ended with a thick pommel and thus resembled medieval maces. The marshal stood against the background of the attacking Polish cavalry. Self-assuredly and arrogantly he looked down on us from above. What is this man thinking about at the moment? The fate of the army he leads has already been decided. At least it was decided just in these days of the battle on the Bzura. The state of which he was the helmsman was on the eve of disaster. He himself, however, as it soon became clear, was no hero. He left his army to its fate and fled to Romania, not forgetting to transport his chattels there, as we heard later in Warsaw, sic transit gloria mundi. After the destruction of the strongest of all the opposing groups of the enemy in the Battle of Bzura, and the fighting that took place in the wooded area south of Lublin, with enemy troops trying to break through from the Modlin fortress to Warsaw, Army Group began to fulfill the task of capturing Warsaw. However, part of its formations had already been transferred to the west, where the French and British, to our surprise, idly watched the destruction of their Polish ally. It was possible to foresee, and the headquarters of the Army Group reported this to the OK, that the preparation for the offensive on Warsaw could not be completed before September 25. After all, for this offensive, we wanted to pull up all the heavy artillery of the RGK, including the artillery of the 14th Army, which was in Galicia. However, after the Soviets declared war on Poland on September 17, and the Vistula was intended as a demarcation line between them and us, Hitler was in a great hurry to take Warsaw. He ordered that the city be captured by September 30. That the political leadership requires the generals to achieve victory is understandable, but the fact that it also sets a deadline for when victory must be achieved, this is certainly something unusual. Army Group Headquarters pursued the goal of achieving victory with as few casualties as possible. It was not its intention to make unnecessary sacrifices for the sake of a certain date. This offensive became necessary in general because the enemy had taken up defences in the city, concentrated in it an army consisting of the remnants of many formations, and because the Polish commander-in-chief declared that the city would be held to the last. For the headquarters of the army group was clear that a sudden attack on the city under the existing conditions did not promise success. In no case, however, he did not want, for whatever reasons it was required of him, to go to battle in the city itself. Such a battle would require from the advancing units, as inevitably as from the population, a huge loss of life. Therefore, the headquarters of the army group ordered the 8th Army, which was entrusted with the capture of Warsaw, to ensure offensive actions to form a tight, continuous ring around the fortress, approximately along the line of the ring road going around the city. Following this, the city was to be forced to surrender by shelling, aerial bombardment, and, if this did not lead to the goal, by food and water shortages. It should be noted here that our headquarters successfully counteracted Hitler's desire to bombard the city at an earlier time, since the air attacks would then not be in direct connection with the war effort and would not bring tangible results. On September 25, fire was opened for destruction on the outer forts, strongholds, and the most important supply bases of the city. At the same time, frequent attacks were launched to reach the intended encirclement line. On September 26, leaflets were dropped announcing the impending shelling of the city and demanding the surrender of the city. As the Polish troops continued to offer stubborn resistance, the shelling of the city itself began on September 26 in the evening. On September 27 in the afternoon, Colonel General von Rundstedt and I learned during a visit to the 18th Division, which I had previously commanded, that the 2 outer forts had just been captured and the enemy had agreed to surrender. The firing was immediately ceased. On September 28, the act of surrender was signed by the Polish commander-in-chief and the commander of the 8th Army, General Blaskowitz. It contained provisions for immediate aid to the population as well as to the enemy's wounded. In general, the terms of this surrender fully met the requirements of respect for the honour of the army. Despite the defeat, showed itself a brave opponent. The act stipulated that officers would retain their swords, that non-commissioned officers and soldiers would be taken prisoners for a short time in order to return home after completing the necessary formalities. According to the Polish plenipotentiary, 120,000 men capitulated in Warsaw. At the signing of the Surrender Act, the Polish general said, "The wheel turns." He was right, although considering the position in which his homeland was later destined to find itself, hardly in the sense he meant. While the main enemy forces west of the Vistula had been destroyed during the Battle of the Bzura and the occupation of Warsaw, in the area of operations of the 14th Army in eastern Galicia, and on the other side of the lower course of the San, there were still many, sometimes heavy battles with separate groups of the enemy who had escaped destruction up to that point. One corps of the 10th Army was also at this time forcing the Vistula at Demblin and north of it, striking at Lublin. In the course of these battles, the Supreme High Command suddenly received an order to hand over to the Soviets Lemberg, which had just capitulated as a result of the actions of the 14th Army, and to withdraw along the entire front occupied by the Army Group to a line agreed upon between von Ribbentrop and the Soviets. It ran from the Ushuk Pass to Peremysl, and then along the San and Vistula to a point north of Warsaw. Thus, all fighting on the other side of the San and the Vistula for the Army Group was useless and led only to the advantage of the Soviets. The withdrawal behind the San led to the cessation of fighting with the enemy grouping of 2-3 divisions and 1-2 cavalry brigades, which with admirable bravery, but without any regard for the general situation in turn, went on the offensive and tried to cut off the 7th and 8th acts of the withdrawal routes behind the San. Here again heavy fighting occurred, which was only a consequence of political manoeuvring between the German and Soviet governments. This is best confirmed by the fact that on October 1 there was again a change in the demarcation line. We were now again to occupy the Lublin Governorate General. The 14th Corps thus again forced the Vistula. It surrendered the last grouping of the enemy, which was retreating under the Soviet onslaught on the Vistula. The Polish campaign was over. Army Group South during the battles captured 523,000, 136 prisoners and 1401 guns, 7,600 machine guns, 274 airplanes, 96 tanks, and a huge amount of other military equipment. The human losses suffered by the enemy, who fiercely fought with the greatest bravery even in a hopeless situation, were certainly very great. Actives of the Army Group were 505 killed, 759 wounded, 42 missing. Non-commissioned officers and soldiers, 6,049 killed, 19,719 wounded, 22 missing. In connection with the casualty figures I have given, which in comparison with the successes we achieved during this campaign seem insignificant, though it does not lessen our sorrow, I will allow myself to honour the memory of 3 men whose deaths have been especially important to me personally. After all, this book should not be devoted only to the description of military operations. It should also contain, albeit on a modest scale, a description of personal experiences. The former commander of the land forces, Colonel General Baron von Fritsch, the man who created the new German army in 1934-1938, a noble officer who could not respond to the diabolical intrigue of the vile people who sought to depose him with the slogan "A Corsair, Corsair et de," died near Warsaw. Brought up on Prussian traditions, the officer's sense of duty did not allow him to direct the army he had created against the state. Later I heard that Colonel General von Fritsch, bidding farewell at the beginning of the war with his former Chief of General Staff, Colonel General Beck, leaving briefly, half-voicedly said, This silent despair also corresponded to his last words, addressed to the adjutant, vainly trying to bandage a gunshot wound on his thigh, as a result of which an artery was severed. Leave it, there is no point. In Poland in September, during the Battle of Radom, my old friend, Colonel Wilhelm Dietrich von Dietwerth, commander of a motorized rifle regiment, also died. In his person for me died a man who had travelled with me the whole way of life, starting from early youth. We were 12 years old when we, the cadets of the Plyon School, became friends with each other. Diko, as he was called by his closest friends, then stayed with Prince Oscar of Prussia in Plön, and I was transferred to the main cadet school in Lichterfeld. 4 years later, fate brought us together again in the rank of lieutenants in the 3rd Guards Regiment. We were instructors for the training of recruits in the same battalion, hence we were together on duty and even more often in our free time. In these days our friendship, which had begun in the Plen, became even stronger. I retained this friendship even after his death and will retain it to the end of my days. Dietwerth was one of the kindest and most courteous men I ever knew. He was tall, intelligent, and susceptible to all that was beautiful and good. Already in his youth he possessed an exceptionally balanced character. His example showed what an invaluable contribution a family living in love and harmony can make to the upbringing of children, a contribution that will last a lifetime. It was a great joy to visit his parents, brothers, or sisters. A few years later fate separated us again. The Kaiser's wife chose him to raise her youngest son, who caused her much trouble. However, we continued to keep in touch, often exchanging letters. In 1913, Dietwerth, to my joy, returned to the regiment again, and we entered the military academy together. But he was soon recalled again to the post of senior adjutant of the regiment, proof that his superiors held him in high esteem as an officer. Nevertheless, we continued to both serve together in Berlin. The war separated us again. Dietwerth began the war as senior adjutant of a cadre regiment, and I of a reserve regiment. As fate would have it, as sometimes happens in life, we came together again during the Battle of the Somme at the 1st Army headquarters as staff officers. In the summer of 1917, Diko was recalled again. The Kaiser's family remembered his remarkable abilities as an educator and wished him to devote himself to the education of the Crown Prince's sons. It was impossible to find a man for the post who could better fulfill these duties. For Dietwerth himself, however, it was, a heavy blow. In time of war, to suddenly return to his homeland, he never became a courtier, and after the revolution, with which his task lost its original meaning, he remained faithful to this task. After he finished raising princes, he entered the service of the Crown Prince. When he decided that the Crown Prince no longer needed him, he immediately followed the dictates of his heart and became a soldier again. He was destined to spend several more peaceful years as an instructor, first of his battalion and then of his regiment. An enemy bullet caught him as he was marching at the head of his guardsmen in the front ranks, firing his rifle. Death did not spare my family either. During the Polish campaign, my wife's older brother, Reserve Rothmeister Konrad von Loesch, was severely wounded in the spine. It was on September 9 during the Battle of He served in the reconnaissance battalion. He owned his father's former estate at Lorsendorf. He was married to Countess Zedlitz and had 3 children. Even such a surgical genius as von Sauerbruch could not save him. Nevertheless, this great specialist by his art, and above all by his cordial attitude, was able to alleviate somewhat the severe suffering in the last months of my brother-in-law's life. He died at the age of 40 in March 1940 at the Charité Clinic in Berlin. This loss was a heavy blow to us all, especially to my wife, who, being only 1 year younger than him, had this man, full of ideals, loved his children very much, was friendly with the people on his estate, and was a passionate lover of horseback riding and his profession as a soldier. He will be remembered not only by his loved ones. On October 5, Hitler held a victory parade in Warsaw. On a large avenue leading from the Belvedere to the palace, defiled past him victorious divisions, which were now in Warsaw and its environs. Despite the battles they had fought and the hardships of military life they had endured, the troops made a fine impression. In the eyes of the young soldiers shone the pride caused by the victory gained in this lightning campaign. Unfortunately, the parade ended with an unpleasant episode, which at the same time shed a bright light on Hitler's attitude to the officers of the land forces. It was foreseen that Hitler, shortly before his flight, at the airfield will talk to the commanders of the formations participating in the parade. Not without reason we expected him in a few words of gratitude. In one of the hangars was set up a table at which Hitler was to taste with the commanders of the soup from the field kitchen. When, however, he entered the hangar and saw the table, covered with a white tablecloth and decorated with autumn flowers, he turned abruptly, went to the field kitchen, standing next to the hangar, tasted a few spoonfuls of soup, talked to the soldiers surrounding him and flew away. Obviously, by such an attitude he wanted to emphasize his closeness to the people. I doubt, however, that our brave guardsmen really approved of his behavior. They would probably have realized that the head of state, after such victories, after paying tribute to the commanders, would also pay tribute to the troops themselves. Towards the former, however, his behavior was a manifest cavalierness which at such a moment made one think. The Polish campaign at the time was called the Lightning War. Indeed, this campaign, in its rapidity and results, was unique in its kind. Until the later German offensive in the West was a similar achievement, but on an even greater scale. In order, however, to evaluate the events correctly, it is necessary to take into account what was said in the preceding chapter about the prospects open to Poland in this war. Indeed, this campaign should have been won by the Germans, if we take into account the much more favourable situation before the outbreak of hostilities, as well as their superiority in the presence of 2 prerequisites. First, if the German command had taken great risks in the West, in order to have the necessary superiority of forces in the East. Secondly, if the Western powers had not taken advantage of these risky actions to come to the aid of the Poles in time. There can be no doubt that events might have developed quite differently if the Western powers had launched an offensive in the West as early as possible. It is true that the Polish command should have taken this fact into account, and, showing a little more common sense, should not have squandered its forces from the very beginning in an attempt to hold what could not be held. On the contrary, from the very beginning of the campaign it should have concentrated its forces in decisive areas, systematically pursuing the goal of buying time, plunging the Germans into the real abyss of a war on 2 fronts. The courage with which the Polish troops fought until the last moment would have created an opportunity for the Polish command to hold out until the Allies, having reached the Rhine, would not have forced the command of the German army to interrupt the Polish campaign prematurely. Thus, as Count Schlieffen once expressed it, the defeated and this time contributed to the cause of victory won by the enemy. On the other hand, however, it must be recognized that the rapid and decisive victory won in the Polish campaign should still be attributed not only to the influence of a favorable operational situation, but also achieved through high-risk superiority on the side of the German, better management of troops and higher fighting qualities of the German troops. An important role in achieving a high pace of the campaign played an important role in the new principles of using independently operating tank formations and the support of aviation, which had overwhelming superiority. But the decisive factor, probably, along with the repeatedly tested bravery of the German soldier and his willingness to sacrifice, was the offensive impulse that took possession of the German command and troops. How obvious it is that the technical equipment of the army is largely due to Hitler's energy. It is equally clear that superiority in armament alone could by no means ensure such a swift and decisive victory. Most important, however, was the fact that the little Reichswehr, which many once looked down upon, was able to salvage from defeat during World War I and revitalize the great German tradition of training and driving troops. The new German army, the brainchild of this Reichswehr, was apparently the only army that was able to overcome the degeneration of warfare into positional warfare, or, as General Fuller put it with regard to combat in the last period of World War II, into the Iron Triangle. The German army was able to use the new means of combat to once again master the true art of maneuver warfare, an autonomy that had not been granted to such an extent to commanders in any other army, down to junior commanders and individual infantry soldiers. That was the secret of success. And this inheritance was again preserved and passed on to the Reichswehr. The new army passed its first test with honor. The command of the land forces was still able to act without interference. The commanders still had in their hands the full power. The troops could still carry out operations of a purely military nature, and therefore they were still of a noble character. On October 3, Colonel General von Rundstedt was appointed commander of the Eastern District. As chief of the civil administration of the occupied regions of Poland, from which the newly created districts were then transferred to the Empire, he was to be assisted by Minister Frank. The Army Group headquarters, which now also included a stage transportation department, remained subordinate to the commander of the Eastern District as its military headquarters. The headquarters of Army Group North was transferred to the Western Front. This decision, Colonel General von Rundstedt and his staff, of course, perceived with bitterness. After all, Army Group South took the most active part in the fighting during the Polish campaign. Now we were left out in Poland, while Army Group North received new important tasks. Besides, it seemed little attractive to us to play the role of occupation authorities, with an administration headed by one of the leading figures of the party. Even before the offensive on Warsaw began, the Army Group headquarters was moved to a small palace, Heleno Palace, located somewhat west of the city. It was a marvelous little Rococo building with long avenues leading to it. The palace stood in the middle of a beautiful park with large ponds. Here we were visited a few days after the fall of Warsaw by our future Chief of Civil Administration. The table was set for dinner. The Colonel General and his staff were waiting for the guest. An hour after the appointed time, Rundstedt said in a frenzy, "Let's begin." Without him, we had just finished lunch when a cavalcade of cars stopped in front of the little palace. Out of the first stepped a figure in a blue suit, solidly trimmed with gold. Under other circumstances, we would have mistaken it for a Cuban admiral. It was Mr. Frank. To our horror, a numerous retinue, uniform after uniform, piled out of the other car. Our cook, who had the rations allotted to us, was not prepared for such crowding. Nevertheless, the table was set. The meat dish, goulash, contained much sauce, but very little meat. We were amused by the fact that Mr. Frank was carefully fishing out bits of meat, providing the sauce for his entourage. It was a clear demonstration of the slogan, "The public good above the private." Mr. Frank then rose, wished to be photographed with the Colonel General in front of the palace, assuming an important pose for this purpose, and then declaring that his time was up, he must return to Berlin to see the Führer, got into a car. The entourage hurried into other cars, and they disappeared. Colonel General von Rundstedt silently looked after them. The meeting on the tasks of our Chief of Civil Administration did not take place. It was never. Shortly thereafter we moved to Lodz, where the permanent residence of the Eastern District Commander was to be located. I proposed to choose for it the former royal palace of Speyler. It was situated among beautiful forests near the city itself. But Mr. von Rundstedt preferred to stay in Lodz. He probably thought that here he would be able to spend his time more interestingly. He was bitterly disappointed. True, we settled down tolerably well in the former headquarters of the Polish Corps, but the city was crowded with people. There were as many of them as I had never seen in my life. It was quite impossible for the commander to appear in this bustle. There was nothing to do, but, in despair, to choose the cemetery as the only place where he could still appear. Since our new chief of the civil administration did not appear in Lodz, and the administration had to be established, we sent our chief of the stage transport department, General Krul, to fetch Frank. Krul searched for Frank all over the country for some time, until he found him at his estate on one of the lakes in Upper Bavaria. The general succeeded in inducing Frank to go to Lodz, I witnessed a rather cold conversation between the commander and Frank. In the course of this conversation, von Rundstedt stated that he would in no way tolerate a branch of the Reichsführer's institution. He asked Frank to take this into consideration in the most serious manner. The latter agreed unreservedly with the commander and ended the conversation by solemnly declaring, "Mr. Colonel General, you know that I am an advocate of justice." After these beautiful words, Frank somewhat hastily said that his time was up. He had to go to Berlin to the Führer and disappeared, just as he did in Hellenua. We never saw him again. He came to Poland only when our staff had already left it, and instead of the role of Chief of Civil Administration at the Army Group Headquarters, he was given the all-powerful post of Governor-General. Meanwhile, 3 Army headquarters left us, having gone to the Western Front. Instead of the commanders of the armies were introduced positions of commanders of troops of the districts, actually with purely territorial tasks. Most of the troops, with the exception of a small number of occupation divisions, negligible compared to the Soviet troops in eastern Poland, were moved to the west. That Hitler was planning to launch an offensive there, soon to be launched, was known to us as well. As a military task, we had only to ensure the security of Polish territory, to train the divisions, most of which had only recently been formed, and to prepare for the construction of a line of fortifications in the east. Already during the parade in Warsaw, Colonel General von Rundstedt had made it clear to the commander of the land forces that he perceived the abandonment of his headquarters for occupation service in Poland as an offence. I had a conversation in the same spirit with General Holder. In the end, I succeeded in convincing General von Stolpnagel, Chief of the 1st General Staff Department, that the offensive in the West could hardly be led by one Army Group headquarters. On October 15, Colonel Husinger from the Operations Department of the OK to us, and brought us the happy news that our headquarters would be transferred to the Western Front at the end of October. Their place was to be taken by the Army headquarters headed by Colonel General Blaskowitz. I myself shortly thereafter received orders on October 21 to arrive to receive instructions for an offensive in the west in Zossen, where the OK was located. On October 18, I left Lodz in order to still have time to visit my family and my severely wounded brother-in-law, who was undergoing treatment in Breslau. Then I started to fulfill new tasks.